At 2:20 in the morning, the lights disappeared before most of the world even understood what had been lost. Out on the freezing Atlantic, a handful of lifeboats drifted across an ocean so calm that it reflected the stars like polished black glass. In the distance, the glow that had filled the horizon only moments earlier slowly faded into darkness. Then, there was nothing. The largest passenger ship ever built had vanished, leaving behind silence, scattered voices, and one question that historians have spent more than a century trying to answer. How could a voyage that still seemed ordinary just 2 hours earlier end in one of the most studied maritime disasters in history? The answer is more complicated than the version most of us grew up hearing. We often remember the story in a single sentence. Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. While that statement is true, it hides almost everything that actually mattered. It does not explain why thousands of people remained remarkably calm after the collision. It does not explain why the ship continued shining brightly while its fate had already been decided below the waterline. It does not explain why some lifeboats left with empty seats, why nearby ships could not arrive in time, or why experienced officers continued making decisions based on information that was already becoming outdated minute by minute. The final 2 hours of Titanic were not a single event. They were a chain of moments in which every passing minute narrowed the number of possible outcomes. That is why this story deserves to be told differently. Instead of beginning with the construction of the ship or its departure from Southampton, we begin at the end, because endings often reveal what beginnings cannot. From this moment forward, we will follow the final 2 hours almost as they unfolded, allowing the surviving evidence to guide us through each decision, each warning, and each realization. We will not judge the people aboard with the benefit of modern hindsight. They could not see the engineering reports that investigators would later assemble. They did not know what deep-sea expeditions would eventually discover on the ocean floor. They only knew what stood before them in the darkness, and sometimes that was very little. Throughout this investigation, it is important to separate what has been confirmed from what has merely been repeated. Official inquiries, survivor testimony, wireless records, engineering analysis, and archaeological discoveries allow us to reconstruct much of that night with remarkable accuracy. At the same time, some conversations were never recorded, some memories conflict with one another, and some questions may never receive complete answers. That uncertainty is not a weakness of history. It is part of history itself. As we move backward through those final hours, every chapter will bring us closer to the moment when the future of the ship could still have taken a different path, at least from the perspective of those living it. Yet there was one detail almost no one aboard understood. Long before the first lifeboat touched the water, long before distress calls echoed across the Atlantic, and long before the ship's bow began to settle noticeably lower, an invisible countdown had already begun. The remarkable truth is that when most passengers still believed they were standing aboard the safest place for hundreds of miles in every direction, the clock was already running out, and almost nobody realized just how little time remained. 11:30 in the evening did not feel like the beginning of a disaster. If someone had walked across the decks at that moment, nothing would have suggested that history was quietly approaching. The air was cold enough to remind passengers that spring had not yet reached the North Atlantic, but the weather itself seemed almost perfect. There was no storm, no crashing surf, and no heavy fog hiding the horizon. Instead, the sea stretched outward in complete stillness, its surface so calm that sailors later described it as almost unnatural. For many aboard, that calm inspired confidence. For the officers on watch, however, it created a different challenge. Without waves breaking against the base of floating ice, an iceberg became much harder to detect at night. During rougher conditions, white water crashing against the ice often revealed its position from a greater distance. On this night, that natural warning was almost entirely absent. High above the deck, the lookouts remained focused on the darkness ahead, knowing that visibility depended almost entirely on human eyesight. Every few moments they swept the horizon again, searching for anything that interrupted the endless line where sea met sky. Behind them, life continued much as it had throughout the voyage. Conversations drifted through the first-class lounges. Some passengers prepared for bed after another elegant evening aboard what many considered the finest passenger ship ever built. Others lingered in public rooms, enjoying the comfort, warmth, and steady rhythm of engines that had carried them safely for days. Deep inside the ship, engineers and firemen continued their routines with practiced precision, feeding the boilers that powered the massive vessel westward across the Atlantic. In another part of the ship, the wireless room remained unusually busy. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were still transmitting personal messages for passengers while also receiving navigation reports from other ships. Earlier that day, several wireless messages had mentioned ice fields and drifting ice along parts of the route. Such reports were not unusual during the season, and experienced captains expected to receive them. The challenge was never simply collecting information. It was deciding how each report fit into the constantly changing conditions surrounding the ship. Captain Edward Smith had already been informed about several warnings, and adjustments to the route had been made earlier in the voyage. Nothing suggested immediate danger, yet the presence of ice was understood. The officers knew they were entering an area where extra vigilance mattered. Even so, no one on board possessed the complete picture that historians can assemble today by comparing every surviving document, testimony, and wireless log side by side. Each person saw only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The lookout saw darkness. The wireless operators heard distant voices. The engineers monitored machinery. The passengers enjoyed another peaceful evening at sea. Each perspective was accurate, yet none revealed the full reality developing around them. That is one of the most remarkable features of this story. Catastrophic events rarely announce themselves all at once. More often, they arrive quietly, hidden beneath routines that appear completely ordinary until one ordinary moment becomes the last one anyone will ever remember as normal. At 11:30 in the evening, there was still time for the voyage to continue exactly as planned, but somewhere beyond the reach of the ship's lights, a silent shape was already waiting, and the distance separating certainty from uncertainty was shrinking with every passing minute. At approximately 11:40 in the evening, the routine changed in an instant, although almost nobody on board realized it. High above the bridge, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee continued scanning the darkness with nothing more than their eyesight. There were no binoculars available in the crow's nest, a detail that has often been discussed by historians, although experts continue to debate how much difference they would have made under the unusually dark conditions that night. Then, without warning, Fleet noticed something directly ahead. It was not a dramatic white mountain rising out of crashing waves. It was a dark shape interrupting an even darker horizon. He reacted immediately, striking the warning bell 3 times and reaching for the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge. His message was brief and urgent. "Iceberg, right ahead." On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch had only seconds to respond. Modern reconstructions estimate that the available reaction time was measured in well under a minute. There was no opportunity to calculate multiple options or carefully debate alternatives. Orders were given almost immediately. The helm was commanded over in an attempt to turn the ship away while engine commands were issued in response to the rapidly unfolding situation. Even today, historians continue examining the exact sequence of those engine orders, but there is broad agreement about one crucial fact. Every decision had to be made before anyone could fully understand the consequences. From the perspective of those standing on the bridge, this was not a carefully studied engineering problem. It was an emergency unfolding faster than human judgment could comfortably process. The enormous ship began responding, but even a vessel of that size obeyed the laws of momentum rather than human urgency. Traveling at high speed across calm water, it required distance that no longer existed. Moments later, the iceberg passed along the starboard side. To many passengers, the encounter seemed surprisingly minor. Some noticed a gentle vibration beneath their feet. Others felt little more than a subtle change in motion. A few later remembered hearing ice sliding across parts of the deck or seeing small fragments scattered near the bow. There was no deafening crash that instantly convinced everyone something terrible had happened. In fact, One of the most deceptive aspects of the collision was how ordinary it seemed to those who experienced it firsthand. The absence of obvious destruction created a dangerous illusion. Human beings naturally judge danger through what they can immediately see, hear, and feel. On that cold April night, those senses provided an incomplete picture. Beneath the waterline, where no passenger could observe the consequences directly, the situation was already unfolding very differently. Compartments that had remained dry throughout the voyage were beginning to receive seawater, although the full extent of the damage was not yet known even to the officers responsible for the ship. Above deck, however, conversations continued. Many passengers remained inside the warm public rooms, unaware that anything more serious than an inconvenience had occurred. Some stepped outside simply to satisfy their curiosity before returning to their cabins. From their perspective, there seemed to be little reason for concern. Yet this quiet confidence concealed the most important truth of the entire night. The collision itself was not the moment when the outcome became obvious. It was the moment when a hidden process began, one that would reveal its consequences gradually rather than all at once. Before anyone could decide what should happen. Next, they first had to answer a far more difficult question. How badly had the ship actually been damaged beneath the surface where nobody could see it? Within minutes of the collision, the most important activity aboard the ship was taking place far below the elegant dining rooms and quiet cabins where most passengers remained. Crew members moved quickly through the lower compartments, reporting what they found as water began entering areas that had been completely dry only moments earlier. These early observations did not immediately reveal the full scale of the problem, but each report added another piece to an increasingly troubling picture. Captain Edward Smith called for Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, whose understanding of the vessel's internal structure made him uniquely qualified to judge what the damage might mean. Together with senior officers, Andrews began inspecting the affected sections as information arrived from engineers and crew members working below. The challenge was that nobody could simply look at the outside of the hull to see what had happened. Every conclusion had to be built from scattered observations inside the ship. One compartment was taking on water. Then another. Soon it became clear that the flooding was not confined to a single isolated section. The ship had been designed with watertight compartments, an advanced safety feature for its time. Their purpose was to keep flooding contained if part of the hull were damaged. That design gave many people confidence that the vessel could survive accidents that would sink other ships. However, like every engineering solution, it had limits. If too many forward compartments filled with water, the bow would gradually settle lower into the ocean. Once that happened, seawater could begin spilling over the tops of the compartment walls into the next sections behind them, creating a chain reaction that no pumps or crew could stop. As Andrews compared the reports, that possibility was becoming more than a theory. It was becoming a calculation. According to testimony given after the disaster, he reached the conclusion that the damage exceeded what the ship had been built to survive. There was no dramatic announcement, no emotional speech, and no visible panic in the corridors below. Instead, there was the quiet realization that the mathematics of buoyancy had already placed strict limits on what could happen next. Above deck, almost nothing reflected that conclusion. Electric lights continued glowing throughout the ship. The engines had stopped, but the vessel still appeared remarkably steady. Passengers walking along the decks could look toward the horizon and see no obvious reason to believe they were standing aboard a ship that had already begun losing its battle against the sea. That contrast between appearance and reality would shape many of the decisions made during the next hour. Human instinct naturally trusts what the eyes can see. If the decks looked level and the lounges remained warm and comfortable, why would anyone willingly leave for a small lifeboat suspended above dark, freezing water? The officers now faced a problem that was no longer purely technical. Even if the engineering assessment was correct, it had to be translated into action before the evidence became visible to everyone else. Time had quietly become the rarest resource on board. Every minute spent confirming reports, organizing the crew, and deciding how to proceed was also another minute during which seawater continued moving through spaces hidden beneath the passengers' feet. The calculations had delivered their answer, but convincing thousands of people to act on a danger they could not yet see would prove far more difficult than reaching the conclusion itself. By a little after midnight, the technical question had become a human one. The officers now understood something that almost nobody else on board could yet imagine. The ship still looked secure, but the margin for waiting was disappearing. Captain Edward Smith accepted Thomas Andrews' assessment, and preparations began for an evacuation unlike anything the crew had ever practiced under real conditions. Orders were passed quietly at first. Lifeboats were uncovered. Crew members were assigned to their stations. Passengers were encouraged to put on life jackets and make their way to the boat deck. 2. Many of them, the request seemed unnecessary. The decks remained well lit, the ship stood almost level, and there was no obvious sign that remaining aboard had suddenly become dangerous. From their perspective, stepping into a small wooden lifeboat suspended over a cold, dark ocean appeared far more risky than staying inside a massive steel liner that still felt solid beneath their feet. That reaction was not irrational. It reflected the information available to them at that moment. The human mind naturally trusts what it can observe, and almost everything visible suggested stability rather than crisis. Crew members found themselves repeating instructions, reassuring nervous passengers while also encouraging hesitant ones to leave the comfort of the ship. Some people dressed warmly before coming on deck because they believed they would return to their cabins after a short precaution. Others carried personal belongings, assuming the interruption would be temporary. There was little sense of urgency among many of those gathering near the lifeboats, not because they ignored instructions, but because they could not reconcile the calm surroundings with the seriousness of the orders they were receiving. This gap between appearance and reality created one of the defining challenges of the entire evacuation. The officers had to persuade people to act before the evidence became visible to everyone. According to survivor testimony, several of the earliest lifeboats were lowered with empty seats still available. Over the years, those empty places have often been viewed as symbols of missed opportunity, yet the circumstances were more complicated than they first appear. The crew was working under unfamiliar conditions, attempting to launch boats safely while maintaining order and following procedures that had never been tested on this scale. At the same time, many passengers hesitated because they genuinely believed remaining aboard offered greater security. Their decisions reflected the situation as they understood it, not the complete picture that only a handful of officers possessed. Every minute, however, the balance beneath the surface continued to change. Seawater kept filling compartments hidden from view, gradually increasing the weight carried by the bow. The transformation remained subtle enough that many people still noticed nothing unusual, but the calculations that Thomas Andrews had made earlier did not depend on appearances. They depended on physics, and physics was advancing 1 minute at a time regardless of whether anyone on deck believed the danger was real. The first lifeboats moving away from the ship marked more than the beginning of the evacuation. They marked the moment when the people aboard began separating into two very different experiences of the same night. Some were already looking back from the water, while thousands of others still stood beneath bright electric lights, convinced there was more time than the clock was quietly allowing. As more lifeboats were lowered into the Atlantic, another struggle was unfolding far from the boat deck, inside the wireless room where every passing minute carried increasing importance. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had spent much of the voyage handling personal telegrams from passengers, but the priorities of the night had changed completely. The wireless equipment that had connected travelers with family and business on shore now became the ship's only voice across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Shortly after the seriousness of the situation became clear, distress calls began reaching other vessels scattered throughout the North Atlantic. The operators worked with remarkable focus, sending repeated messages that included the ship's position and its urgent request for assistance. These signals traveled invisibly through the night, reaching ships that the people standing on deck could neither see nor hear. Among those receiving the messages was Carpathia. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, immediately understood the significance of the distress call and ordered his ship to change course at once. Every practical measure was taken to increase speed while maintaining control. Extra lookouts were posted, preparations were made for survivors, and the crew organized blankets, hot drinks, and medical supplies long before they reached the reported position. It was an extraordinary response, but there was one obstacle that determination alone could not overcome. Distance. Carpathia was many miles away, and even at her highest safe speed she required several hours to arrive. The rescue had already begun, yet it could not outrun geography. At nearly the same time, another ship would become part of the story for very different reasons. Californian was believed to be significantly closer, but the events surrounding her actions remain among the most carefully examined aspects of the disaster. Testimony given during later investigations revealed that members of her crew observed rockets rising in the distance. At the time, however, there was uncertainty about what those signals meant and exactly which ship had launched them. Historians continue to debate certain details surrounding communication between the two vessels, but the surviving evidence consistently demonstrates one important reality. Confusion, limited information, and the absence of complete situational awareness shaped decisions on every ship that night, not only aboard the one in distress. Back on the decks, few passengers knew anything about these invisible exchanges taking place through the wireless equipment. They could see lifeboats being lowered. They could hear instructions from officers. What they could not see was a race already unfolding across the ocean, measured not in courage but in miles and minutes. Every distress signal created hope that help was coming, yet every calculation confirmed that help remained frustratingly far away. The officers continued launching boats while the wireless operators continued transmitting, each group performing different tasks that served the same purpose. Time. Everything now depended on gaining as much of it as possible. The remarkable discipline shown by the crew in these moments often receives less attention than the tragedy itself, yet it formed an essential part of the night's history. Every message sent, every lifeboat lowered, and every instruction given represented an effort to create opportunities before the narrowing window finally closed. But while rescue ships were turning toward the reported position and lifeboats slowly spread across the calm Atlantic, the vessel at the center of those desperate messages continued changing in ways that had become impossible to ignore, and the quiet confidence that had defined the early hours of the evacuation was beginning to disappear. By around 1:30 in the morning, the gradual changes that had once been easy to dismiss were becoming impossible to ignore. The forward decks now rested noticeably closer to the surface of the Atlantic than they had less than an hour earlier. Passengers who had delayed leaving their cabins began arriving on deck to find an atmosphere that no longer resembled a simple precaution. The officers continued directing people toward the remaining lifeboats, but their instructions now carried a greater urgency than before. Even so, discipline remained remarkably strong. Survivor testimony consistently describes crew members continuing their duties with determination despite the growing awareness that time was slipping away. The transformation of the ship was not sudden. It unfolded almost quietly, minute by minute, allowing many people to witness the change without immediately understanding what it meant. Electric lights still illuminated the decks and public spaces, creating a strange contrast between familiar comfort and steadily worsening reality. Looking back from a modern perspective, it is tempting to imagine that everyone aboard must have recognized the danger at the same moment. The historical evidence tells a different story. Awareness spread unevenly. Those working below deck had understood the seriousness much earlier through engineering reports and flooding observations. Officers on the bridge relied on those reports while managing the evacuation. Many passengers, however, formed their conclusions from what they could personally observe, and only now was the evidence becoming unmistakable. The angle of the deck grew more noticeable. Walking required greater attention. Conversations became quieter as more people realized that returning to their cabins was no longer a realistic possibility. The gap between appearance and reality that had defined the earlier stages of the evacuation was finally beginning to close. For Thomas Andrews, this stage confirmed what his calculations had already predicted. According to survivor accounts, he continued moving through different areas of the ship, encouraging people to make their way toward the lifeboats. His role during these final stages reflected the quiet professionalism described by those who encountered him. He understood that no new calculation could change the outcome. Only the remaining minutes could still influence how many people reached safety. Nearby, Captain Edward Smith continued overseeing the evacuation while officers supervised the loading and lowering of the remaining boats. Each successful launch represented another group placed beyond the immediate danger aboard the ship, yet each departure also revealed an unavoidable reality. The number of available lifeboats was steadily decreasing while many people still remained on deck. This was no longer a question of whether the evacuation should continue. It had become a race against a process that could not be negotiated with or delayed. Below the surface, seawater continued advancing exactly as the ship's designer had feared. Above the surface, every visible change reinforced the same conclusion. The vessel that had seemed almost untouched after the collision now displayed unmistakable signs that its balance was changing. Across the surrounding ocean, lifeboats drifted farther from the ship, their occupants watching from a distance as the silhouette that had dominated the horizon slowly settled lower against the stars. Some later recalled how difficult it was to believe that a ship so enormous could continue sinking almost silently. Yet the evidence from engineering analysis and survivor testimony points toward the same remarkable truth. The decisive battle had never taken place on the open decks where everyone could watch. It had been unfolding below the waterline since the moment of the collision, and now, as the remaining lifeboats prepared to leave, the invisible process that had begun nearly 2 hours earlier was finally becoming visible to everyone aboard. By the time the final lifeboats were preparing to leave, historians agree that the outcome itself could no longer be changed. What remained uncertain was not whether the ship would be lost, but how the final minutes unfolded for the people still aboard and what combination of circumstances had brought them to that point. For more than a century, countless books, documentaries, and investigations have searched for a single explanation. Some point to speed, arguing that the ship was traveling too quickly through an area where ice had already been reported. Others focus on the unusually calm sea, where the absence of breaking waves made floating ice much more difficult to detect in the darkness. Still others examine the ship's design, noting that the watertight compartments represented advanced engineering for their era but were never intended to withstand flooding across so many sections at once. Each explanation contains an important piece of the story, yet none fully explains the disaster by itself. The historical record consistently suggests that the sinking resulted from several independent factors aligning within the same narrow window of time. If the sea had been rougher, the iceberg might have been visible sooner. If the collision had damaged fewer compartments, the ship might have remained afloat long enough for rescue to arrive. If assistance had been significantly closer, more time could have worked in the passengers' favor. If the danger had been immediately obvious after the collision, the earliest lifeboats might have departed with fewer empty seats. None of those possibilities can erase what happened, but together they illustrate an important truth. History is often shaped not by one catastrophic mistake but by a sequence of ordinary decisions and natural conditions that become extraordinary only when they intersect. That conclusion is supported not by speculation but by the combined evidence preserved through official inquiries, survivor testimony, engineering analysis, and later examination of the wreck itself. Each source contributes something valuable while also carrying limitations. Survivors remembered events from different locations and under different levels of stress. Official investigations gathered extensive testimony but could not answer every technical question. Modern archaeological discoveries clarified aspects of the damage that no witness could have observed directly, yet they cannot recover conversations that were never recorded. When these different forms of evidence are placed side by side rather than treated separately, a more balanced picture begins to emerge. The disaster was not simply the result of nature, nor solely the consequence of engineering, leadership, communication, or chance. It was the convergence of all those elements, each making the next problem more difficult to overcome than the one before it. That understanding changes how we view the final hours. Instead of searching for a single moment when everything went wrong, we begin to recognize a gradual narrowing of possibilities. Every passing minute reduced the options available to those on the bridge, to the engineers below, to the wireless operators sending urgent messages into the darkness, and to the passengers deciding whether to remain aboard or step into the waiting lifeboats. By the time those separate decisions finally merged into one unavoidable outcome, the conclusion had already been written by the combined weight of circumstance, physics, distance, and time. Yet even after reconstructing the night through every available source, one important question still remains, because understanding how the disaster unfolded is only part of the story. The greater lesson lies in what those final 2 hours continue to reveal about human judgment when certainty disappears and every decision must be made before the complete truth can be seen. When the first light of dawn reached the North Atlantic, it illuminated an ocean that looked almost unchanged from the night before. The water remained calm. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction. Yet the silence carried a different meaning now, because beneath that peaceful surface rested the final chapter of a voyage that had begun with extraordinary confidence only days earlier. Rescue ships gradually arrived where the distress messages had pointed them, finding lifeboats scattered across the sea exactly where the surviving wireless records and eyewitness testimony suggested they would be. For those who reached the area later that morning, the ocean revealed very little about the sequence of events that had unfolded during the previous 2 hours. The evidence that mattered most had already become invisible beneath thousands of feet of water. That is why understanding this disaster has always required more than memory alone. It requires comparing official investigations, engineering studies, survivor testimony, wireless logs, navigational records, and, decades later, archaeological exploration of the wreck itself. Each source tells part of the story. None tells all of it. Together, however, they allow a reconstruction that is remarkably detailed while still acknowledging the limits of what can truly be known. Some facts are firmly established. The collision occurred shortly before midnight. Multiple forward compartments flooded beyond the limits of the ship's design. Thomas Andrews correctly concluded that the vessel could not remain afloat indefinitely. Distress signals were transmitted and received. Rescue efforts began immediately but were limited by distance. Lifeboats carried hundreds of people away before the ship finally disappeared beneath the surface at approximately 2:20 in the morning. Those events are supported by extensive historical evidence. Beyond those confirmed facts lies interpretation. Historians continue discussing individual decisions made on the bridge, the handling of ice warnings, the exact sequence of certain commands, and the actions of nearby vessels. These discussions remain valuable because they remind us that history is rarely a collection of simple answers. It is an ongoing effort to understand complex events through incomplete evidence. Responsible investigation does not force certainty where certainty does not exist. It recognizes the difference between documented fact, informed analysis, eyewitness memory, and unanswered questions. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate across generations. It is not simply about the loss of a famous ocean liner. It is about the fragile relationship between confidence and uncertainty. During those final 2 hours, experienced officers, skilled engineers, wireless operators, crew members, and passengers all acted according to the information available to them at the time. None of them possessed the complete picture that later generations would assemble from surviving records. That perspective encourages humility rather than judgment. It reminds us how often human beings must make important decisions before every fact is known. More than a century has passed, yet the questions raised by that night remain surprisingly modern. How should warnings be interpreted when they appear uncertain? How should leaders balance confidence with caution? At what moment does preparation become action, and how do people respond when visible reality conflicts with invisible danger? The final hours of that voyage continue to matter because they offer no convenient villain and no single explanation powerful enough to account for everything that happened. Instead, they reveal something both simpler and more profound. History is often shaped by the convergence of natural forces, human judgment, engineering limits, communication, timing, and chance. When those elements align in just the wrong way, ordinary moments can quietly become extraordinary turning points. That is the lesson preserved by the evidence, and it remains as relevant today as it was on that calm April morning when the ocean kept its silence and the search for understanding had only just begun.